Next up, we have Emile Stipp, Director of Actuarial and Data Science at Vitality, with me in the studio for a conversation about how behavioural science can be used to improve health and well-being. So, Emile, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, John. Great to be here.
We're here to talk about behavioural science and its application to health and well-being. I think it's probably a good place to start if I can ask you to define what behavioural science actually is.
Sure. So it's really analysis of human behaviour, and particularly looking at if we can understand, I guess, why people make decisions that are often against their own interest. So I think it started really with stock market and trading. So why do people buy shares at the peak of a bubble and sell when it's at the trough? But it goes well beyond that. So particularly about health and wellness also, you know, we all know that we should exercise more and we should lose weight, and yet we struggle to do so. And it's really the science behind that.
Mm-hmm. And how it works in practice, obviously, I think, Vitality as part of the Discovery Group have spent a long time implementing this, and we'll probably come to some of these more in-depth things later on about how it works. But can you give us a sort of overall example of how it can be used in practice to encourage people, as you say, to live healthier lives or even take their well-being into greater consideration?
Yes, so I mean, we're in a very interesting phase of our company now. We started basically 30 years ago, and in South Africa at the time where Discovery started, there was a gym group called Health and Racket. That it was an aspirational brand, and they actually came to Discovery when it was young to say, "Don't you think it's a good idea to sell insurance to gym members?" And what made all the difference is that the people at the time there, Adrian Gore, the founder, actually thought about it the other way. He said, no, we're not interested in that. We want to sell gym membership to policyholders. And that actually created a few things. The first one is that it moves away from just selecting healthy people out of the population and moves towards saying we need to make people healthier. Then what we understood is that became an incentive in itself. So Vitality, as you know, is all about incentives. And we developed a whole lot of insight into how people respond to incentives. And then crucially, the one thing that it led to is that an enormous amount of data on how people, just how they behave and how they respond. Because the bottom line in the end is that much of risk, in fact, the majority of the risks that we face in our lives are behavioural. Depends on our own behaviour, sometimes on other people's behaviour, but mainly on our own behaviour. And if you understand that, and if you think then about how incentives can be used to change that behaviour, that's when you end up with an entirely different business model.
Now, that's quite a broad topic, and I'm sure it's far more complicated than that overview. But I mean, when we're talking about behaviours, now this can be conscious or unconscious, correct? Yeah. This can be something someone decides to do, or something someone does on impulse, for example, or by learned behaviour that they're not thinking about properly. Yeah. So what's the role of data here within behavioural sciences on that decision-making element, where it is a conscious decision for someone to say, right, I'm going to join a gym, or I'm not going to exercise this week, for example?
Sure. So I mean, every person is different, and that's the power of modern data sciences. It can be, give a lot more insight into individual motivations. But for instance, if you just think about where things have developed. So initially, we focus on giving people pretty big rewards for a year of activity. Mm-hmm. So if you join the gym, if you exercise regularly, you get 50% off a plane ticket. That worked for some people, but then we realized, and particularly here in the UK, we realized that if you were to say to somebody, if you exercise this week, and we give you a free coffee for doing that, actually we find a very significant uplift in activity. Just even though it's a smaller reward, the fact that it's regular and it becomes part of your routine. So that then leads to habit formation. So what we saw at the time of launching that is actually there was about a 33% increase in activity levels. And then we have what we call a habit index, which we developed to see when is behavior becoming habitual. And what we can see is that initially when the benefit is launched, there's a large uptick. It does go down a little bit, but actually the level at which it settles is significantly higher than where it started off with. The second thing that we did then is with Apple Watch, which was interesting because there we built in one of the sort of central tenets of behavioral science to say that if you do own something, you have a strong loss aversion. You don't want to lose it, and you'll do a lot not to lose what you already have. So what we did is to say to people, you can get an Apple Watch for free. You don't have to pay for it if you carry on exercising. If you stop, then you have to start paying for the Apple Watch. So that sort of taps into loss aversion. So what we saw when we launched that is that it led to a further 34% increase in activity. Now, what's remarkable about that is that those sort of statistics are very consistent, whether we're looking at the US population, UK, South Africa, even Australia, it sort of settles at the same level. And that's interesting. It seems as if there's an inherent sort of human element that people respond similarly to similar incentives. And that's very powerful when you understand those parameters.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting around that behavioural graph, so to call it, where you watch the spike and then you watch it come back down and then plateau.
Yeah.
In terms of your focus then, I assume it's that plateau then that you're more interested in because you want to see how far that's sustainable.
Exactly. And one can't rest on your laurels. You have to keep it interesting. You have to launch new benefits and new sort of rewards every year, which we do, and also new ways to communicate it to people. So what we're working on more recently is really focusing on specific disease and also focusing a lot more on personalization. Mm-hmm. So the data systems have developed now to the extent that even though you have very complicated machine learning models that are typically opaque, we can actually tell why it's predicting a particular result for a particular individual. And then we can start personalizing both the hurdle that they need to reach to get the reward, but also the reward itself. We can tell how people living in London would differ from people living in Bournemouth, what sort of rewards appeal to them, and then we maximize all of that. So you optimize all of the algorithms. Mm-hmm. And we're starting on that journey now, and it seems to be initially very successful. As soon as people get the sense that the communication and the rewards are more relevant to them, they respond to it, obviously. But it also seems then that it is more sustainable and keeps the behaviour keeps on at a better level.
Mm-hmm. And from a provider perspective, looking at that personalisation piece, how difficult is that to sort of manage, I suppose, in terms of, well, if you have Group A and Group B through Z, for example, that all want different things in terms of their individual offering of what you can provide. Again, is there a sustainability question there in terms of what the provider can actually offer?
Well, we haven't hit that that limit yet, because there's always so many things that we get approached with and look at as potential rewards, but also there's already quite a lot that you can choose from. So, and the other thing that is very important, John, is that to an extent, when people start behaving more healthily, that in itself becomes a reward. Mm-hmm. So we do also see that you find that people who start exercising, typically their nutrition changes as well. So they eat more healthy food, they tend to go for more screenings. There's a whole lot of behavior that becomes part of a person over time. And as long as you reinforce that and you keep on giving people rewards, it has a lot of staying power. They live for those rewards, mm-hmm. They get it, they get a real kick when they get it. And they track what they're doing. So, I think there's a lot of sort of inherent motivation that comes out of the whole system once it's set up.
And with those cases where you're seeing that sustained, as you say, behavioural change, for example, like nutrition or exercise, for example, are there cases where that's still occurring and yet the interest in the reward side drops off, or is there a direct correlation between those two on the same level going forward?
So you wouldn't be surprised to learn that we've classified people. So some people are what we call maximizers. They would literally do anything to get a free coffee. So they would run a marathon just to get a free coffee. For other people, no matter what you offer them, they would still not do it. Mm-hmm. And there you need to look for different motivations, such as those inherent ones, perhaps social motivations. Some people love exercising in groups. We have to find in the data basically what appeals to people and then try and tap into that. And it also depends a lot on their underlying state of health. So the way that we talk to somebody who's in their 50s or 60s is and should be even more different to the way that we speak to somebody in their 20s. And what we see very clearly is that as you grow older, there are very important sort of points. So the habits that you establish in your 30s whether you exercise or not. That's a very crucial point at which it determines whether you lead a healthy lifestyle for the rest of your life or not. If you get older, we need a very different approach. And I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. So as I said, everybody knows they need to lose weight and they need to exercise more. If you know that and you haven't done it for 40 years, then offering you a gym membership it won't work for you. We need a different approach. And that's what we're doing a lot of work on at the moment. And it does seem to be working. So we will refine that as the data comes in, because these things are so important for lots of different conditions. And, you know, people face different health challenges at different times in their lives. So mental health is a big issue. We can certainly see from our data very clearly that the more you exercise, the lower your risk of mental conditions. And even in the sort of detail, and we saw it particularly in the pandemic as well, outdoor exercise is much better for your mental health than indoor exercise. So, you know, all of those things are interesting, and it's behavior that you can reinforce and learn from in the data.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us a little insight into how that data on the mental health side of things is formulated? Because, as you know, I would imagine anyway that data around physical health is relatively easy to gather and measure and quantify. Yeah. Data around an intangible factor like mental health, for example, I mean, what's your approach to that?
So, we are a health insurer, so we get a lot of healthcare claims, but we actually change our approach because, and I think it's a challenge for health insurers across the world. I think treatment often arrives too late. So what we did actually before the pandemic, almost by chance and luckily, is that we launched an online cognitive behavioral therapy program. And what we saw is that there was a lot of demand for it at that point, but during the pandemic it increased dramatically. Mm-hmm. I'm an actuary, those sort of things worries me because the costs go up. But actually when we look at the data now, it's remarkable. We see that more than double the people access mental health services, but the admission rate went down dramatically, and it's sustained. So we still see it now, even though, you know, sort of the way that people access healthcare is sort of normalized after the pandemic, which means that the costs have actually remained the same. So what we've managed to do over this period is to give access to more than double the people to mental health treatment, but at the same time keep the costs at the same level. So I think you know, there's more and more data as technology develops. It's a key thing that we all have to make use of, is to use technology to pick up what are the needs of people. There's obviously a whole lot of questions around that, but if it's transparent, if people understand the role that we play and that what we do with the data, then I think it does become powerful because you can look for those solutions in the data.
Mm-hmm. And looking at those incentive piece, obviously you've said a couple of times that, you know, different groups will respond differently to different incentives. But based on your data, what have you seen works best? I mean, for an example, let's say a younger group or an older group of people, what incentives are generally seen as the most effective?
So I think we've the example I used earlier, I think, was a very good learning point for us. In the end, it has to be regular, and people need to be reminded. So smaller incentives, more regular, and something that's free is very appealing. So the free coffee certainly worked incredibly well for us. The loss aversion, as I said, but when you look at older people, what we find is that the hurdle is very important. So it doesn't help to say to somebody who is very unfit and unhealthy that you need to walk 10,000 steps a day. We have to start at 3,000 or 5,000 and maybe build it up over time. And just encourage people maybe just to walk a few times around the block. And eventually they start enjoying it. As soon as we see the habit forming, then we say, well, maybe do you want to try a little bit more and get an additional reward? So that's a level of personalization that we're working on. But there's also a whole lot of other factors playing a role. Socioeconomic status, where people live, what are the available rewards partners, whether you live close to a park, for instance, has a big impact. And it's using all of the data to try and tap into that and to design the rewards a lot more specific to the person's circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, moving away from mental health, I mean, what does your data sort of show on physical health conditions like cancer, for example, or chronic diseases?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, if there's one thing that everybody should remember from this is the more you exercise, the better. There's almost no point at which it becomes too much, and we see it across the board. So cancer, as you say, it's a very powerful correlation, particularly, and we now have data over several decades. When you look at lifetime behavior of exercise, literally the more you exercise, the lower your risk of incidence. But also, if you do get cancer, and if you're unlucky and you get diagnosed with cancer later in your life at 60, if you exercise up until that point, your outcomes are much better. Mm-hmm. So we find that you have lower cost of hospitalization, your survival rate is much better, recovery probabilities are much better. So it has an overall positive impact. There's lots of other lifestyle diseases, heart disease, obviously, diabetes. There's all of these relationships in the data. There's almost nothing that exercise is bad for, or in fact there is nothing that exercise is bad for. Fascinating thing that we saw very early on in the pandemic is because we have all the data, and particularly in South Africa, because our insurance there paid for the tests and also the pathology that came out of the tests, we could see who tested positive or negative for COVID. And became, within a month, we can see in the data that people who exercise, for all other factors being equal, tend to have a much lower risk of being hospitalized for COVID. In fact, the rule of thumb that we developed at the time is that if you exercise regularly, from a COVID perspective, you basically face the risk of somebody that's 20 years younger than your chronological age. So if you're 60, you face the risk of a 40-year-old if you exercise regularly. Now, that's valuable because it both tells you what people should do to avoid the risk, but also who's really at risk then, people who don't exercise, if they get diagnosed, and we could intervene then using that knowledge. Mm-hmm. So it's across the board. It really is one of the most powerful things.
Okay, well, we've got quite a few questions for you from our audience. It's clearly interesting quite a few people. So we'll start off with, as you said, there's a personalisation element here. In terms of your data, what do you see in terms of engagement with different age groups, for example? Are you more likely to see greater uptake and sustainability with people of a younger age or an older age, for example?
So I think there's a sort of sweet spot from 30 to 50. When people start engaging with the program, they tend to stick to it. I think it's always a struggle to reach people in their 20s, both with insurance, but then also with lifestyle. And to be frank, if you're in your 20s and you drink 3 beers a night, it doesn't really have that much of an effect on you. If you do that until you're 60, it does. So I think in the Middle Ages, it is very important to reach people and to establish that habit of a healthy lifestyle, and that's actually where we see most benefit in the program as well. It leaves you with the sort of long-term consequences of it. But as I say, we're now trying to focus especially on the older people and the people who haven't really responded, and trying to see if there's more ways to reach them.
And just as a kind of side question to that, do you think there's also that sweet spot you mentioned, is that also to maybe have a factor of people taking more stock of their life beyond just their health? Also, as you say, that financial well-being element, people are thinking more about, their retirement, their pension, their savings. Do you think that plays into it at all?
The biggest thing that plays a role is when you have children. So that's when people really think about insurance, about whether they have adequate healthcare cover, their lifestyle. I guess it gives them that sort of perspective that's beyond themselves and just how much fun they're having, and how many beers they're having, and it gives them a focus on something else, trying to provide for their families. So we really do see that there are certain points. There's also the point at which people get diagnosed with chronic disease for the first time. That comes later. So if you're in your 40s and you're diagnosed with high blood pressure, that could be the trigger for a lot of people to start exercising and to really look at their lifestyle. There are quite a few points that you can see from the data that really has an impact on how people respond to things.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question here about that sort of behaviour formation, and that's asking sort of how long, well, I suppose it would depend on the data set, how long would it take for a behaviour to shift until it becomes a habit? I mean, what does your data tell you in that generally?
Yeah, so it's a bit of there's a time element to it, but it's also how dramatically the behaviour changes. So there's an interplay between those two, but typically what we see is that let's say about 6 weeks is the point at which something becomes a habit. Obviously, also there are life events that happen. So there are reasons sometimes that people then stop exercising for a while, and then you can see how long it takes thereafter. But people start enjoying it after, a few weeks of activity. That's when they get that internal motivation.
Okay, and so beyond just, say, like you say, people can be very, like the childcare element you've said, they need to look beyond themselves. Looking beyond, say, their own well-being, I mean, do you see any data or insights into people's values and how that plays a part in it at all?
There's a lot of things about personality that we pick up in the data. So, we're in 37 countries. We cover a whole lot of different insurance products. What's interesting, for instance, is that we see out of the data in South Africa, just to give you one example, that people who go to the dentist regularly tend to exercise more, but they also tend to drive better because we have a telematics car insurance product there. And you can sort of speculate about whether there's an underlying level of behavior and personality that we observe in the data, and I think there's a lot of evidence in that. It also comes out in the way that people manage their money. So we see certainly naturally the people who lead healthier lifestyles tend to be a higher socioeconomic status, but the things are related. So there's the cause and effect are not always clear in these sort of relationships, but they're certainly there. And that's why when you establish a better lifestyle, it probably has a whole lot of other knock-on benefits as well.
Mm-hmm. And they've got a question here about the reward, engagement with rewards. I mean, what's the response when you start to notice that people aren't paying attention to that particular reward anymore? Maybe it becomes, as you say, part of their everyday. It's not seen as a reward anymore. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so it's always a little bit difficult because when you take away rewards that aren't working, there are always a few people who enjoy it. So one has to offer something else then to those people. But we try and work with the program all the time, and obviously we're dependent also on the reward partners. They need to provide a good service. People need to find them an aspirational brand, and that's important to us. So we actually make changes fairly regularly. In fact, at least annually to the reward program to keep it fresh. We don't always get it right. Often you have to iterate a few times before it starts working and working well. But that's part of the sort of interest and joy of it, that you can actually experiment with all of these different reward partners and see what appeals to people, and try and refine it over time. But certainly we do look at it. If people don't respond to it, if for some reason the customer experience is not fantastic, then those reward partners won't last in the ecosystem.
Okay, well, we've probably got time for one or two more questions.
Sure.
And one is around correlation and how will you quantify or control correlation versus causation?
Sure. Very good question. I can talk about this for an hour. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm very confident. It's a topic for another discussion, that with the techniques that we have now, we can actually prove causation. So the first way we do it is we look at dose response. So can you say that if you give more rewards, that people change their behavior to a greater extent? And if you observe that, can you say that it leads to better health outcomes? We can prove that from the data, longitudinally adjusted for other risk factors. Now what we do is causal inference, where basically instead of just doing a model that identifies correlations in the data, we basically say, how do we know the world works? So if you exercise, it's good for you at a basic level, it's good for your blood pressure, your chronicity, it's also good for your BMI. All of those effects add up. We postulate that, and then we use the data to prove that it does. So those sort of techniques are now a standard part of our toolkits, and they work very well, and they really give us insights that that I think are very fundamental.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be selfish and take the last question for myself. Sure. And I wanted to put to you, like, in your experience of working with these data sets and these models, what's been the most surprising result you've seen with this kind of behavioural change?
Sure, you're putting me on the spot now. I tell you the things that really made a difference to us, that I've mentioned it already, is realizing that this is not only about non-communicable disease and lifestyle behavior, but actually it's very fundamental to all disease. So the COVID experience was actually a true breakthrough for us. And it really did change our whole strategy with how to deal with COVID. But the other things that have surprised me is just how predictable things actually are. I think if you have a lot of data, it just becomes incredibly obvious how people's behavior is actually very consistent as they grow older, as you offer them rewards and how they respond to it, and how people basically fall into fairly broad categories of the way that they respond to that. And that's really, once you have those insights, it really does allow you just to do business in a different way. But I think also importantly, and this is what's so satisfying, we truly see that people are becoming healthier. Not only in those that respond, but the whole population. More people are exercising. And I think in the UK now and also in South Africa, it's almost at a population level that the consciousness about lifestyle is changing. And that's fantastic. It's wonderful for society, and it's been a wonderful experience to be part of that.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Emile, for coming in and joining your insights. It's been really interesting to hear about some of the stuff you guys are doing.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.